Had an intense set of presentations. I hope I do not put you off to sleep, and I will do my best to keep you entertained. However, many of the concepts that we've discussed here have already been discussed in some way or the other, but probably I'm presenting them from a slightly different angle. When I decided to contribute to this conference, I chose this topic, and at that time I thought this was a good idea. As I started working on it, I realized this should have been a PhD thesis. It's not brief enough to be presented in a 20-minute session, but I'll do my best anyways, and maybe we'll go ahead and do a PhD again on this topic from here. The objective of the session is to consider some Indian and Western perspective on the nature and origin of selfhood, to discuss some of the similarities and contradictions in these two approaches, to explain with the help of the three sociological perspectives why the manner in which the concept of self and identity are conceived and propagated leads to conflicts. The three sociological perspectives being symbolic interactionism, and conflict, and functionalism. Finally, we will try to recommend a new approach to conceptualizing selfhood. It is a rather, you can say, hasty approach given the phenomenal size of the problem. Yet I am trying to make an attempt, and I am open to suggestions for improvement by all means. So there have been many methods that have been used over centuries to understand the concept of self, methods like intuition, observation, reflection, experiments, and analysis, both in Eastern and Western civilization. In India, the ancient scriptures like the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Gita provide teachings about the nature of the self, very profound and phenomenal teachings which also have reflections in Western philosophy and even in empirical science in recent times. And in Western civilization, of course, you have biblical concepts that provide. It is very striking some of the similarities that I came across in these two approaches. For example, in the Indian traditional mythological stories, I found a story that the first man was there was a man, and the first female was created from the body part of the man. And I think there's a very similar story in the Bible. So the similarities are simply striking. Not many people know about these similarities. However, the Indian philosophy looks at the self as a transient phenomenon, and therefore mostly an illusion. The true self, according to the scriptures, is called Atma, which is the essence of life. It is an ontological principle underlying all reality, the life force, and it pervades all living things. It is immortal. Can also be equated to the concept of soul in Western civilization. Self-knowledge, knowing the Atma, is considered the highest form of knowledge and the greatest goal of man. And along with Atma, there are some other concepts like pranas, which include the breath, the sight, the hearing, speech, and mind, and the knowledge of the five fires, five Agni Vidya. Abstract concepts like cloud, earth are considered as energies, basically five forms of energies. And like I said, self-knowledge is the highest achievement, and it is postulated that the knowledge of self leads to moksha. Moksha is freedom from the cycle of birth and death. The Indians believe in reincarnation, and they believe that there is a perpetual cycle of birth and death, and liberation from this cycle is enlightenment and moksha, salvation, whatsoever. You have similar concepts in Western civilization. Now, how is Atma categorized? In the Upanishads, in different types of, there are many types of Upanishads with different authors. They have classified it differently. Somebody says that it defies categorization. Someone else classifies it as Tat Tvam Asi. Tat being the perceiver, Tvam being what is perceived. Literal translation, that thou art. It is basically the essence of life. Meaning, the perceiver and the perceived are undivided. This is a fascinating concept. Knowledge of Atma leads to obtaining all the worlds and fulfilling all desires. The consciousness that lies hidden behind, or which underlies perception and cognition. So Atma is that consciousness which lies behind the conscious mind as we know it. While Atma, which is equated with Paramatma. Paramatma is the eternal essence, we could call it God, and it functions and interestingly, every individual has the same essence. And the same essence or Atma is equated with the eternal essence or God. I'm not sure if I'm drawing a correct parallel here, but probably the concept of Tao in Chinese philosophy, that talks about energy that pervades all living beings, could be a rough parallel, if not too accurate. However, for functional purposes, Indian society is divided into different groups of people known as castes. The Brahmins being the highest caste, custodians of the true knowledge, and which is a secret knowledge passed on only through the Brahmin sect and so on. Of course, I totally disagree with this classification, but that's how it is. The social self is considered more important than the individual self. Man's birth into society is considered his second birth, dvija, and is considered of greater value, more real than his natural birth. Probably like the Holy Communion in Christian society, I don't know where it's a very important ritual where a child enters some sort of religious, gets a religious identity. Maybe a rough and inaccurate comparison, I'm just thinking and speaking as a whole. When people die, now the fundamental questions that Indian philosophy tries to answer, and there is some phenomenal work done there. When people die, do their Atmas all merge into the same Brahman, the eternal essence, or do they remain separate identities? In Western civilization, they remain separate identities, right? But this is a question, and there's been a lot of debate between the Buddhists and some other schools, and this debate it continues. The self, what are the questions that these debates try to answer? First, they try to see whether the self is a unit of existence that endures over time. Is it an unchanging self, or is it a momentary self? Probably what we saw just a while before about the non-permanent nature of things, and the debate about what is being perceived, whether that thing exists only in a moment or it exists over an extended period of time. For example, some of us have met in the past. One school of thought says that the people meeting today have nothing in common with the people who met in the past, though this illusion that we are the same people persists. So there is no fundamental being there, and this continuity is perceived because of a sequence of cause and effects that gets stored as memory in the brain. However, another school of thought believes that there is a fundamental real self that continues. Then the second level of the debate is between self as substance or self as quality. Does a thing exist because of the substance that it is made up of, or is the essence of that thing the quality that it possesses? Is fire because of the chemicals that burn or whatever fuel is consumed, or is fire because of the nature of what it does, because of the quality that it possesses? And finally, is the self a plural entity, or is there a unitary self, changing or unchanging? These are profound discussions, and due to shortage of time, I cannot go into these elaborate concepts, but if you look them up, you're likely to find them, and we thoroughly enjoy them. In Western civilization, from the study of William James, the father of modern psychology, we have some amazing insights into the concept of self. James believed that the empirical self of each one of us is all that we call ourselves as me. So whatever we mean when we refer to ourselves as me is the empirical self. Further experts have commented in recent times, it's a psychological structure embedded in a social system. And finally, the self is an abstract object, a theorist fiction, generally. What is self-awareness? Self-awareness and the awareness of others are closely linked because both require a cognitive capacity for secondary representation. Now, this is what modern neuroscience tells us, and this is exactly what ancient Indian philosophy has been postulating in the literatures that I've gone through. Another quote I have for you: one simple distinction that allows for the social consideration is differentiating the self from the others. By 24 months, most children recognize themselves in the mirror. So the ability to recognize the self is very closely connected with the ability to recognize others. And this happens only around the age of 2 or something like that. Let's watch this video. These sort of motions are very typical, and children sort of conduct an experiment, and all of us have done this, by the way, and we may not have any memory of. And talking about memories, something very interesting happened. When I came to Hawaii, I met a childhood friend of mine who's been living in the United States for several years. We haven't met in the last 15 years or so. And we were childhood friends. We grew up in the same neighborhood. And I spent the last 3 days with him. And he told me phenomenal stories about things I had told him, which apparently had a phenomenal impact on him and supposedly changed his life. And we apparently had these discussions over months and years while we were growing up till the age of 13 or so. I have no conscious memory of this whatsoever. And it was a complete shock that such discussions had happened. So, am I the person who had those discussions? It's spooky. Yeah? So, okay, self and identity. Now, according to James, he proposed the concept of the duplex self, the segmented self, where he differentiated between the concepts of me and mine. According to him, the self has three parts. First is the constituents of the self, second the feelings and emotions, and finally the actions that the constituents trigger. The constituents of the self being the material self, the body, the clothes, the immediate family, property. The social self includes the recognition from friends, family, society, role perception, role identity, all the concepts that we carry about each other in our heads. Is the social self. And James goes on to say that this social self is so dear to man that hurting any one of these social selves is like hurting the man physically. And people are so attached to those concepts that others have about them. And he explained. Finally, the spiritual self being the inner subjective being. There is an interesting parallel in Indian philosophy of the concept of Vivek. Vivek is considered directly connected with consciousness, with human consciousness. And consciousness in Indian philosophy has many levels. And the more one is able to meditate and reflect and practice, the higher is the level of consciousness that one can achieve. And it is also related with the power of discernment. So this Vivek is the power of discernment. This is quite similar to the spiritual self that William James talks about, and the parallel is there for everyone to see. And then there is the concept of the pure ego, the personal identity, the consciousness of personal sameness over past, present and future. James says that this is illusory and more a feeling than a verifiable fact, exactly what Indian philosophy said for centuries. Similarly, social identity arises, but unlike personal identity, the ownership of self is ascribed to an external brand. This is fundamental. And I think this is quite an amazing contribution from James, that social identity means we ascribe ownership of the self to an external brand. We do not say that India belongs to me, we say I belong to India. Right? And then there is no such entity as India. There is no such entity as America. There is no such entity as woman, man, anything that has agency. Right? So then it gets even more spooky that within this social concept, often there are random elements that may play a role, and the individual may seem to have be acting in a group and representing a group in some way without any identifiable agent that can be pinpointed. Interestingly, this brand is an abstraction, a concept with no identifiable agent. Now we move on to another concept of the story itself, the narrative of the self as proposed by McAdams. Lying somewhere between pure fantasy and slavish chronicle, life stories are psychological constructs, psychosocial constructs that aim to spell out personal truths, narrative explanations for life and time that are believable, followable, even compelling. So compelling that people are willing to sacrifice the real biological self for the abstract concept. All the wars in the name of religion, nationalism are proof of this. Now, social agency, according to different experts, arises in different ways. There are three types: individual, proxy, and collective agency. And as per Houston, the properties of self that facilitate agency are intentionality, power, and rationality. However, I wish to point out that emotion and compulsion are other factors also that link to agency. Compulsion is different from intentionality. One may not have an intention, but within an event or a situation, one may feel compelled to act in a certain way, sometimes even against one's own free will. And this happens quite a lot. Then we all know that Bandura talked about autonomous agency, mechanical agency, or emergent interactive agency. Autonomous agency has now been mostly rejected by experts by and large. It's very few people actually defend the concept that an individual is an agent who actually acts upon the environment and or has the capacity to do so. Mechanical agency being a reactive sort of agency that the individual possesses, that an individual acts or is forced to act because of the affordances within the environment or the structural you can see situations the person is placed into. However, more consensus now moves towards emergent interactive agency, which seems to emerge as a result of human interactivity. Movement and vocalization suffice to orchestrate beliefs in a cultural physical world where people engage with each other, artifacts and institutions. From Stephen's web academia page, but that's very relevant. This is exactly what we're trying to say. But I also want to draw your attention to the concept of means proposed by Dawkins. Means are sort of cultural entities and abstract entities which seem to propagate through civilization, just like genes, and they also drive agency, and this is another fascinating concept that we need to look at. Now, does identity drive agency? If identity drives agency, that means the key concepts would be a person's self-concept, the perception of the situation, other concepts like esteem, efficacy, belongingness, motivation. These are key concepts, and a lot of research has been published on each and every one of these topics about how they relate with agency. Again, we don't have enough time to discuss this. However, for any concept of self to emerge, we've already seen that there has to be a concept of otherness or otherhood. And the self is usually perceived only when we are able to contrast ourselves with, for example, the concept of man can only be perceived when we also understand the concept of woman, right? And so on and so forth. So, but the problem with this is that this then leads to gender stereotypes and role perceptions and expectations and other fallacies which we know very well that are not accurate, and they're more like illusions that our mind seems to perceive as real. Identity has contradictions and inherent conflict. There are subgroups within groups, and often they disagree with the concepts and so on. And this is what I was trying to point out earlier, that there is no such identity that is homogeneous or uniform or that has a set of characteristics or qualities which are unique to that group. Such groups do not exist. All types of have a vast variety of abstract qualities in them. For example, every type of saint and every type of sinner is available within America and within India and China. The same is the case with, but when we perceive and we assign these sort of qualities to groups, it's more an error of the mind than a real. In addition, there are concepts like role conflict, because no individual plays one role. We are sons and daughters, and we are professors, and then we are students in another situation. So we become so many different people in so many different contexts, and there is no, again, constant even person. Then there is interpersonal conflict, intergroup conflict, mutually exclusive goals. Very rarely people have the best of friends, in the best of marriages. You will never have people having identical goals or drives at any particular point of time, and conflict is inherent in the very nature of selfhood. The very fact that there is an awareness of self being distinct from other, it predisposes us and puts us in situations of conflict. And then we have overt versus covert behavior, social instincts versus appropriation. We are social animals, we cannot exist in isolation. However, we have a very strong desire for appropriation. Even young children can be seen bickering over things, even in rich families. For small things when parents can easily afford to provide kids everything. The desire to appropriate and keep things for exclusive personal use. Self is in that sense associated with objects in the environment that the individual wants to own. So, to cut a long story short, there are many flaws in the concept of self and identity. The key ones being concepts like exclusivity and privilege. Social groups invariably have these concepts. Example, America first, and in every country you will find some in some form or the other. And also superiority. And this is necessary. If there is no sense of superiority, there would be no self-esteem. The very fact that you have to feel good about yourself, it comes at an expense of some concept of otherness somewhere out there, consciously or unconsciously, that is put in contrast to the self. And that is one of the reasons all the religions of the world keep fighting. Everyone provides an exclusive path to divinity or eternity, and they all have the same terminal goals. They fight over their instrumental goals and so on. So that's it. These are the concepts. The conclusion for this whole story is that the new sort of selfhood needs to be conceived, because the self actually exists because of interpersonal mirroring. We exist in each other's eyes, in each other's minds, and there is no empirical individual self that exists, but there is a collection, an abstraction out there within this very difficult to navigate. So then there are some references I have that support what I'm trying to say, that if we change the manner in which we teach selfhood to children, it can lead to addressing the problems that the world is faced with. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I will be happy to take them. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. This is a really interesting and obviously dissertation-worthy, several novels worthy of trying to even break the surface of how many different people have talked about these types of things and how interesting they are to bring together. But I want to focus on one thing that you said about how conflict is sort of inherent to relationships. And this is good because you need to differentiate yourself even from your closest partners, friends, siblings, family, etc. Maybe even inner groups. It's important that to be an individual, you have to be in contrast. But I wonder also if that continuity in discontinuity isn't also that much more important. Like a successful relationship, partnerhood, brotherhood, whatever, partnership, like that involves you're not only defined by the fact that you're going to fight, but the fact that fighting is a part of your cooperation or some other. It doesn't mean that one always wins out of the other, but the fact that you must get them together. Like you must have that continuity and discontinuity, that constant conflict and yet cooperation.
Yes, you're correct in a way, but this is also paradoxical. We succeed as a species mainly because of our ability to collaborate and because of the compassion that we show to other beings, which seems to have biological roots because of our mirror neurons and the prefrontal cortex which has evolved, that we can put ourselves in each other's shoes. So therefore we collaborate. However, there is conflict because the moment you perceive the self as another and then you want to appropriate. Appropriation is the seed or the source of negative conflict, right? I cannot have religion A and appropriate all divinity and eternal salvation to religion A and deny that concept to others, because these are abstractions. There is no empirical verification at all. Then another group of people feel threatened and they feel their very reason for existence is being taken away from them, and that leads to these religious wars. And that's where it goes bad. It would be very, very good if we can evolve this sort of an understanding that yes, while we compete, we take care of each other as well. And that sort of sportsman spirit in civilization needs to be nurtured. That's why a new concept of selfhood. If we were to teach children from childhood and not give them labels, boy, girl, Indian, African labels, and tell them, for example, the first thing we ask children when they come to school, where are you from? What is your name? What does your dad do? These kind of questions. Instead, if children are free to write whatever they want to write about themselves, right? You tell me, no parent tells a child who the child is. Now, this is very radical. right? And it is unexplored and needs to be studied. I mean, we can't take up a radical change just like that. I'm just saying that there are new ways of thinking that need to be explored and investigated. We haven't got it right yet. Right? I hope I answered your question. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the brilliant presentation. It's not a question, it's just how it brings to my mind how things are interrelated, especially if I think in terms of the Ubuntu philosophy or way of thinking, when the self is defined as linked and related to the other, that you are a human because of thanks to other humans.
Sure.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Maybe we will talk about that when I will do a presentation on how in some languages you cannot describe the self without referring to the other, vice versa.
Yeah, brilliant. Sure. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
May I ask you a question? I remember that Michael Billig has already talked about banal nationalism, and he showed us how to use languages or some signs to represent nationalism. And for self-identity and or selfhood, would you talk about linguistic representation of self-identity?
Yes, this is very nice. You see, what happens is, linguistically, we are limited within the symbols that we use. Because when we define the self using language, then we have two options. First, we need a set of labels, and then we need a set of definitions, concepts, abstractions to sort of elaborate on these labels. Right? Now, the problem is the moment we label something, right? We put it in a box, and then we need a contrasting label to put something else which that thing is not. Now, how do you define something without also defining what that thing is not? The problem is that each and every one of us is everything. Right? That is the problem. So these categorizations and differentiations are illusions. That is what the literature says, whether it's in Buddhism or other Indian traditions, that the self is an illusion. It's simply an illusion. And this is exactly the view of empirical scientists, so many of them, including many sitting here today. Right? So there is a problem when we use language. We need to really sit and think about how to overcome this. How can we conceive an entity without putting it into a contrast? One possible solution that comes to my mind is, let's promote the concept of global citizenship. There is no contrasting other to a global citizen. Instead of having a world full of Americans, Indians, Chinese, if you have global citizens, then that implies stewardship of the planet, right? So you don't need contrasting otherhood until you find some aliens. At least till that time we are safe. When that happens, then we think of something else.
This conversation really reminded me of very common quote in the
Sorry, can you get a little louder?
Claire from publication. The book is called Multilingual Matters, something like that. Right, okay. Through which there are multiple examples of the narrative selves in a oral way to describing the momentary ascribed identities through multiple languages. How our memory works perhaps has a lot to do with the temporal spatial relationship to self and what to be selected as a memory, retell, rewritten, re-narrate into our mind and to readjust our own identification of self or as a moment being. So it could be ascribed or prescribed or projected.
Wonderful, very nice. However, we have a major problem in that situation. The problem is nothing is more unreliable than human